Welcome, everybody. Tonight we are working on Unit 9. The topics for Unit 9 you can see listed on the screen here. One of our primary things we're looking at is another layout technique using CSS Grid. We're going to look at some additional CSS styling techniques, including how to create shadows on objects, working with borders and rounded corners. We're going to look at how to style forms and tables, because we really kind of didn't do that when we learned forms and tables. And we're also going to learn a few extra types of input fields for forms, play with them a little bit and style our forms. That's kind of like the lay of the land for tonight. CSS Grid materials, I don't plan on doing an extensive demonstration of that. I will talk about the techniques. But as I was mentioning before I hit record here, that I have these couple of videos here that I've linked up on YouTube. Two different people basically talking about the same technology, kind of from different perspectives. I think both those videos are excellent. They're not very long, and they really cover most of the major features of working with CSS Grid. What I will say, and I'm going to say this over and over again, is there's lots of different ways to lay out web pages. Kind of like different ways to build a house. You might want a ranch house, you might want a duplex, you might want a, colonial, whatever it is. And none of them are right or wrong. They're just different, floor plans, different layouts, different designs. And when you start looking at laying out websites, it's kind of the same way. And which approach you choose to take really kind of becomes a personal choice, usually based upon getting the effect, either the effect that you want easily, or the one that you gain comfort with. Sometimes that comfort is gained by, let's say, like you're working for a design build firm that makes websites. They might tell you, no, this is the one we use, so that's the one you're using, right? So they just coerce it. Or, if you have the choice to choose, and then you start building projects using one technology, there's a really good chance you're going to stick with it because you know how to work it. The framework of it, what techniques work well under certain circumstances, so you just kind of keep leveraging it. I do say that in the assignment description. So for example, we're going to talk a lot about CSS Grid, but there's no requirement to add it to your homework this week. However, if you do, you can earn extra credit, and it's kind of easy extra credit to earn. So my thinking is that why not just go ahead and do some of it. We're going to look at the structure of it, how it works, what it is. And then as we kind of move forward next week, when we start looking at media queries and responsive layouts, then we'll have in basically like in our tool belt, like, for example, not just one hammer. We'll have like 3 or 4 different hammers, and now we get to pick which one we want to use, because some hammers are better for certain things than others, right? And that's kind of the mindset. And then which you choose to use for your website, I mean, it becomes a very personal choice, right? And there's no right or wrong, right? If it gets up on the screen and it looks good and it delivers the information, then it's right. That's kind of the answer. So there's no coercion to use any one of the approaches, but eventually you'll probably have to pick something to get your website to look the way that you want it to. I do have a bunch of notes here that I've been doing this kind of regularly with you guys to show you kind of some of the basic code. I'm not necessarily going to lecture directly from this material. I might a little bit. But let's start talking about CSS Grid as a layout technology. It is really kind of a reaction to the fact that when we were doing layouts, and I'm just going to kind of put a time frame on it, like 20, 30 years ago, and we started getting CSS even as a tool, right? Because there was a time when that wasn't even around, and we started doing floats and all that kind of stuff. It was pretty challenging. It was challenging to get a nice layout. It was challenging to make it work consistently. But you could, right? Like if you put the time in, you could really get some killer looking layouts. And then if you found a technique that worked for you, you could just adjust it and adapt it to just about any project. Eventually people figured out that there's got to be a better way. And then you started seeing products like Bootstrap. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just take us out to the web here, and I'm just going to talk about Bootstrap a little bit. Um, because it is such a popular tool. So you can't really go out into the workplace and not know about this. You know, it's like, even if you don't use it, um, I've never been super huge on using it, mostly because I didn't have to, but a lot of the big editing products have it built in. So in other words, like if I use, for example, Dreamweaver or WebStorm or Visual Studio, and mind you, not Visual Studio Code, but you can edit the Visual Studio Code also. A lot of them have these things like, okay, new website. Do you want to use the Bootstrap, layout technique? Yes, you check a box, and then all the libraries are there, and then you just start coding, right? And what it brings to the table basically is a collection of JavaScript and CSS files that are pre-configured, where all the styles are pre-created, and then you just start applying them to objects on the page, and things become beautiful looking very quickly. They have examples here, like, so you could go in, and I don't know, I'm just going to pick one here randomly. Okay, so this is not what I expected. I thought they would have like a layout that I could look at. Yeah, okay, so here's some like examples, right? So little screenshots. And as you look at like how the pages look and the typography, how stuff sits on the screen, and remember, all of these are examples of what you can do with it, so not necessarily finished websites. But if you look at some of this stuff, like for example, like look at this like pricing page. I mean, this is the kind of thing you see in a lot of websites, right? It's a very common kind of layout. In fact, what a lot of people do is they just use like the most basic Bootstrap templates, and they just dump their content in there, and it just works, and it looks beautiful, and they didn't do a lot of effort on it. And great, if it works and it's a good tool, go for it, right? It's kind of my mindset on it. So we don't teach that here in the class, because really it's kind of a whole field of study when you get into it. However, once you understand how all these technologies work together, it's really easy to adopt, right? So if you were put into a workplace where people were using it or wanted you to use it, it wouldn't be a steep learning curve to pick up the information. The other thing that I'll point out is if you do go to your My Gateway page, I'm going to see if it logs me in here correctly. There we go. I was a little wondering if it was going to. And you guys have a tile somewhere that's got like a bunch of software listed in it, and I'm just trying to find that. And you can tell I never use it here. All right. Well, somewhere you guys have one of these things in My Gateway, and it lists like Microsoft. Oh, here we go. Okay, finally, right there it is. But it has all these like little things listed in here, right? Like you might go into Brightspace this way, and you might go into Office this way, and all that stuff. Here's an icon that you might want to check out. This one's called LinkedIn Learning. And LinkedIn Learning is basically a platform that is owned by Microsoft. It's attached to LinkedIn, which is a professional social networking site for IT people, by the way, which you guys should sign up for at some point. But what's really cool about this website is this is kind of like technology related tutorials and courses, like a massive, huge library of them, right? And so the reason I'm kind of pointing this out, if there's anything you want to learn about that we're not teaching you, or let's say you go for a job interview and they say, hey man, you need to know Bootstrap, you can come in here and you can kind of look up any tech topic, like for example Bootstrap, and then you'll see that they have courses in it. And this isn't just like you got a little video. I want you to notice it's like 4 hours and 20 minutes worth of content, and it's a complete course, and they do the whole concept of walking you through the technology and teaching it to you step by step, right? Pretty cool. And as Gateway students, this is free as long as you're a student here and have an email account. So I encourage you, like if you want to learn this, go in here and look the stuff up. For example, if I wanted to come in here and learn Flexbox, I'm sure they have tutorials about that. They sure do. Or if I just want to learn about HTML, you know, and notice they have 25 course results, not video results, course results. They have 25 different courses um, in this, and you can look at, you know, like the dates, like how new the stuff is. And I think it's really, really cool that you have availability to this. And if you maybe get bored with the level of instruction I'm giving you here, which sometimes happens with people, you know, for some people it's like just right, for some people it's too much, and for some people it's not nearly enough, right? And usually the ones where it's not nearly enough are people that have already kind of done it a bit before and really are hoping to ramp up their skills faster. And what I always recommend to people is like, yeah, this is a great website for learning technology quickly, for picking up new concepts that you might need for the job. And man, you think of a topic in technology, they're probably teaching it here, right? And this is not a free platform, by the way. Like if you were to pay for it out of pocket, it's like 80-90 bucks a month for a subscription. As long as you're a Gateway student, you get complete access to the entire library for free. And they have all sorts of cool stuff, like and it's not just coding or web stuff. They also have stuff about like graphic arts, music production, you know, video editing. I mean, I got all sorts of really crazy stuff. Most of it is screen focused technologies though, so stuff you do on your computer basically. Or hey, maybe you want to learn about like Microsoft Word or Excel. They got courses in that too. You know, all of it is here. I think this is an excellent resource. In some cases, and I don't know like if this is true for all the courses I'm looking at here. Like if you went into some of the courses.
Hi, I'm Nikia Narasimhan. Hi, I'm Jasmine Greenaway.
All right. And yeah, I'm not going to play the video, but some of these will have actually, I don't see that this one does. Some of them will have like these little quizzes that you do. And if you go through the whole course and answer all the quizzes correctly and complete all the work, they give you a badge. And then you can put that badge on your LinkedIn profile. And then people might hire you based upon that. And I think that that's kind of an interesting aspect of this. The other thing that I always tell my coders as well is, you know, like what we do as a living requires that even after you graduate and you go out and you get a job, that you have to kind of still keep learning, because in this field, the technology changes all the time. Like the way that I'm building web pages now was not the way I was building web pages 30 years ago. I mean, HTML was brand new 30 years ago, you know, and so was the web. It has changed radically since then, and I would not be able to even teach it if I didn't keep up by learning all the time. New languages, new frameworks, new technologies, whatever it happens to be. And then you have a website like this that can totally help you, and you have free access to it, man. This is like, I know YouTube is really good and has a lot of great stuff, but the materials in here are really, really well vetted and created by people who are experts in their area and really good at teaching it at the same time. So highly recommended. Remember, you can get to it here through my gateway and this little quick links panel, LinkedIn Learning. And if you sign in that way, there's no real barriers to get in to the content. All right. Let me get some of this stuff off the screen here. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to dig into W3 Schools to talk about CSS Grid, and I'm going to use, let's see if I can just find the content here without actually having to search for my links about it. All right, so here we go. So we are going to talk about CSS Grid layout, one of our big topics for the day. And I do want to kind of point out the fact that this is kind of like the third major layout technique that we're looking at. Of course, you can just do straight HTML, right, without doing any layout techniques, and it works. The other kind of approach that followed that one was the CSS floats technique. And then Flexbox came along, and very quickly after, we had tools like Bootstrap and CSS Grid. CSS Grid is a pretty important one, I think, because I do see a lot of people using it out in the field. And like I said, I don't think it's maybe as popular as Flexbox. Um, and the, but people do use it sometimes to lay out their whole page, sometimes just to lay out portions of a page, right? When they can't get a part to behave the way they want, they sometimes revert to it. So important to note, sometimes you can actually mix techniques. You can use Flexbox with CSS Grid. I don't necessarily think that's a wise idea, but you can do it, right? All right, so let's kind of look at their material here and kind of go through it. I'm not going to hit all the topics in here. I just want to really kind of hit the major ones, look at some examples, and then have you think about whether or not this would work for you. So as it says here, the grid layout module offers a grid-based layout system with rows and columns. The grid layout module allows developers to easily create complex web layouts, and it makes it easy to design a responsive layout structure without using float or positioning, right? And the kind of the mindset here on that is float and positioning can work really well, but it can also be really, really challenging, especially when you're brand new to it, to get it to behave. And in fact, I know like people that have been doing it forever that use float and position and go, oh my God, this is driving me crazy. I can't get it right. Right. So, and that alone drives people to these types of tools. All right. So they have a little bit of an example here, right, where they have kind of a sort of typical looking layout, right? You got a header, a footer, content area, nav on the left. And we can, let's look at this little snippet here first, and then we'll go into the try it thing. But it says grid versus Flexbox. It says CSS Grid is used for two-dimensional layout with rows and columns, where Flexbox is used for one-dimensional layout with rows or columns. Now, to kind of really kind of understand what that means, you have to kind of dig into both technologies. But I do want you to hear really clearly, right? Rows and columns are the essential structure here. And whenever we're putting anything on the screen, in fact, look at the W3 website right now as we're looking at it. Like if you start to break it down, I mean, that's what it is, right? And I'm going to draw on the screen here. You can see there's this area up top, right? That looks like a row up top here. And then maybe within that row, there's some columns, maybe not. I'm not sure how they're putting the stuff in there. Then you have this like sidebar, you have the navigation area, but very clearly there's a rectangular kind of framework, right? And it really is kind of the secret sauce of the web, that everything on a web page kind of falls into these, structures. Everything basically is going inside of a rectangular box, right? And that's why we have the CSS box model, because even a word, like just one word of text is in a box, or the whole paragraph is in a box, or it might be in a container that's a box that holds the paragraph that's a box. You see what I mean? And it's all these like layers of boxes working with each other. So I think that's pretty important to kind of wrap your head around, because that's a fundamental aspect of the grid layout. And let's just kind of look at this example here. And I think what's helpful first, right, whenever you look at layouts and you got a bunch of CSS on the screen, is to first look at the HTML structure, so you kind of get what they're, what's the framework I'm dealing with, basically. As you'll see in a lot of examples, when you start talking about CSS Grid, they do set up a container, right? And I think it's really important to note that this part of the page, which is basically this stuff up here, is not inside that container. So right away, we're seeing a mix of standard HTML and CSS Grid. And if you start looking at the styles, you can see very clearly and quickly that all the styles apply to the container, which is the blue box below. So in many ways, like when I do like these little demos, I sometimes just kind of get rid of that stuff, so we don't even have to look at it. Um, and then I kind of also play with the size of the screen. I just want you to watch what happens to the box as I grow and shrink it. Like I can get super wide, it holds its shape. I can get super narrow. Well, that's not great. Kind of goes off the edge of the screen. But think about like a phone, it's never really going to get much narrower than like this, right? Probably not. Let's put it somewhere around here. And most of what we're going to be looking at is the CSS here. So notice first the grand structure. We have a container, which is a div that holds everything. So all the stuff that's inside that big blue box is inside a container called a container. Notice they set up a div inside the container with the class header, a div with the class menu, which is this, the content, which is this, and then another one, which is the footer. It is important to note, right? And you know, you could use the semantic HTML tags here. And frankly, I'm not really sure why they're not, right? So this could just say, you know, header, right? And that could just say nav, and that could just say main or section or article or something like that. And then this could just say footer. They chose to do divs. It's kind of more the old school approach, but whatever. They're just boxes, and then all of them get names, right? So you can see that they're putting a name on it by virtue of adding a class. Now they chose to add a class, and I think this is particularly weird because I would have chosen ID, but it doesn't matter. You can still apply a style to a class and then adjust it. All right, so let's look at what they're doing with the CSS then as we kind of step through the structure here. The first thing that they're doing is they're issuing a display command for the outer container, saying that everything inside here is going to follow the CSS grid. So when I say grid for display, that's how we trigger CSS grid to function. That's the command, right? Then anything that sits inside this container, so that would be header, menu, content, and footer, all of that stuff is part of that grid. We do set up different template areas, you know, and you notice what they're kind of doing here. This is kind of like a weird thing, but I want you to kind of contemplate that the most number of columns that I have sitting over in that blue box is basically 2, right? I don't see it in the header. I don't see it in the footer, but I do see it in the center section. So when I say grid template areas and they say header, what they're saying is the header occupies the whole top. Then in the next row, it's going to be menu and content. And on the bottom row, it's all footer. That's kind of what they're doing with that little piece. They have different commands that they use. So for example, we'll learn about some of these. And actually, I think like those videos that I kind of pointed out, they do a much better job of explaining how all the little different nuances. But they also have these, what we call grid template columns. And you can see we have a 1FR and a 3FR, and then a gap of 3. And then they're putting in padding and other kind of things like that, right? But what they're really trying to do is set up the outer structure of the grid on the container level. When we start to apply the styles to all the other things here, I want you to notice that they use some interesting commands. And basically, they're doing this kind of in a weird way. This basically set up the layout, right? And I want you to notice how weird that is, right? Okay, so if we got like 2 columns here, the top is all header, then we got menu and content and footer. If you start to look at the 1 in the 3FR, that's kind of saying that we're taking like 1 frame space for you know, the 1 column, and the remaining columns, which, you know, you can use this line as kind of like a divider, as an imaginary divider, basically saying that each row here has, you know, basically the 1 frame width, and then the other one's got the 3 frame width. And if you could like evenly cut this up, there's 4 frames total. How do I know that? Well, I add these up, and there's 4 frames total. The 1 column is simply 1 frame in size, The other column is 3 frames in size, right? All right, so that's kind of the approach, right? And this is just one approach for CSS Grid, by the way, but it works well, and you can see that it works well. And then here, when we have, let's say, the header, and then which grid area am I pushing it into? Well, it's going to go in the header. Notice the header occupies both the 1 frame and the 3 frame area, so the header would basically fit into both of those and sit up here. When I go to the menu, right, we put that into the menu area, which is just this one, right? Content, right, which is the second column item, which is 3 frames wide, will end up here. And then the footer, spans both columns and would sit down here, right? And that's pretty intuitive, really. But just to see the mechanics of it and how simple the mechanics are. Now, think about this, right? Like if you were building a website and you wanted this layout, well, here you go. You're all set, right? Now you just got to start dumping your content in. And there's not really a lot of work that goes into it. The beauty of it, of course, is not only does it kind of give it a nice structured look, and keep in mind, you don't have to have blue lines between everything, right? People don't have to see that, but it does respond really, really well, right? And that's important, right? In today's world. When we code, remember, we code for the big screen, but then when we push it out, 80-90% of our viewers are looking at it like this. And the fact that it responds well is one reason why people like to use this, even if it's very, very simple. And this is a very simple example, but you can see how powerful that can be. Of course, you can play with these settings. Really, these settings up here, these 2 rows are really kind of, well, let's just say these 3 rows of code really establish the setup, and then the rest of it is just telling it where to go, right? And this is a really popular approach, and it works remarkably well, right? Now, they kind of go into an explanation here, and they talk about the fact that a grid always consists of these elements, right? A grid container, and that's, we call that the parent container, right? Where the display property is set to grid, or you can choose the other option is inline grid. That one's more popular if you are just doing it on one spot in a page, but not really necessary, frankly. The approach that we just saw, we are making container nestled in with regular HTML, and it worked just fine, right? And it responded and everything. So it always consists of a grid container and then 1 or more grid items, which we think of as the direct children of the grid container, meaning they're inside the container, right? And then the triad editor, just remember, right, like the container here, right, which ends down here, holds everything else, right? And that, okay, and this is a different try it out, but anyhow, it's the same difference, right? Same concept. So this is kind of interesting here. The element below represents a grid container, the blue area with 5 grid items. They show us, once again, very, very simple code. And what I really like about, kind of working here on W3 Schools is they show you the code. And if you like the technique that they're using, hey man, just copy the code, drop your stuff into the structures, and you're up and rolling really fast, right? And then you can tweak it and make it whatever you want, right? So just trying to give you ideas. I wouldn't consider that cheating. That's just how we do web work. That's just how it's done. Once again, we have a container where we say display grid. Notice this is kind of interesting because on the previous example, how did we do it? We actually set up 3 rows and we said header, menu, content, footer, right? And then we just described how big the frames were or whatever. And here, what they're saying is basically we're working with 3 columns and they're all automatic. Their size is automatic, right? So we're not declaring a size. We're not declaring what's going in there, but we do have 3 columns. All right, so that's the outer container. Then when we have any of the divs inside there, we basically make them all a certain size, and then they just kind of fit inside the item, right? So like if you do a try it now on this one, so here's the example, right? And once again, this is our structure, right? And what they're doing here is they're saying in the grid container, we basically have 3 columns. So why is it we have 5 boxes? Why isn't it 5 boxes across the top? Well, because we set up 3 columns just to prove the point, right? So if I took one of these away and then ran the code, now I have 2 columns. See how easy that was? I mean, it was super easy. So you can tweak that to your heart's content, and play with it until you get, number of columns you think are appropriate for whatever your website is. And that's pretty helpful. Once again, if I start adjusting the screen, notice that it will respond. It does get down to a point where it breaks, and right there is kind of where it breaks, but your phone would never, ever, ever be that narrow, by the way. Why is it breaking? Because the material or content inside, these individual divs, you still have to leave room for the text, and you still have to leave room for the padding or whatever else stuff you put in there, right? And so at some point it can only get so small, right? And then it starts to break out of there. But there's fixes for that too, actually. So I think that's a really kind of useful and basic technique. Maybe even simpler than the first one that we looked at. And that works remarkably well. And once again, if I wanted to, let's say, add 4 columns, right? There you go, right? Or if I wanted to have 5 more divs or whatever, I just paste it in there. There you go, right? And then I can adjust that to whatever I want. I want to go down to 2 columns, okay, right? If I want to go back up to 3, and they just automatically scale. I don't have to size anything. It just works, right? And I think that's really cool, and very, very simple to apply. And so therefore I would encourage you guys to give that a try. Now I could very easily grab this code and put it on my own web pages and show you that it works on my web pages too. And if you do try to use CSS Grid, that's one approach you could use. So I might just kind of do it really fast just to show you how easy it is to earn the extra credit for this unit. But I'm not going to accept generic content, right? So like if you're putting in a grid layout, I don't just want boxes with numbers in them like this. I want it to be like if you're building, I don't know, maybe you're doing recipes on your website, and I want these to be recipes, or I want these to be maybe pictures. That could be a thing that you could put in there. Or maybe you're doing a video game and these each box has a character in it or something like that. It should be based on your content. Now what I'm going to do, just to kind of get into coding mode here, this is pretty normal. I'm going to go to where I store my files, and this has become somewhat routine for us here. I'm going to make a unit 9 folder by copying unit 8. I'm going to just paste it back in, right? This is as per normal for us. I'm going to rename that to unit 9. And then I'm going to open up my Visual Studio Code here. And I'm going to close my Python files. And then I'm going to open that folder. And we'll just select that folder. And then my project is opening up inside here. I'm going to get rid of the welcome screen and the chat bot on the side, and all my stuff is ready to roll. Now I have been working, remember, on kind of like my code test pages, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open the index page with the live server plugin that we talked about last time. And remember, every time I save back in Visual Studio Code, this web page will update automatically. And really what I'm doing right now is I'm just looking at my pages really quick to kind of remember where I left things at, right? And that happens to me all the time, right? And it's not a very pretty looking website, but whatever, I'm doing a lot of demonstrations. So we had this website where we tried, some floats and all that kind of weird stuff. And then we used this technique here, right? And if you look at the page source on this, what technique did we apply here? well, not that script. That script comes from the live server, by the way. But notice we did, a container, right, with item 11, 12, and 22. And what was the technique that we applied to that down here? It's probably way at the bottom. But that was the flex technique. So here we were using flex for I'm trying to get back to it here, the code 2 page. What I think I might do just to demonstrate CSS Grid is I think I'm going to probably just do it on this page. And that's kind of weird to do it that way. Now, you know what? Maybe I'll just make another page. Here I am waffling on my decisions here, but hey, whatever. So I'm going to make a copy of my code test 2 page, and then I'm going to paste it back in here. And guess what I'm going to call this one? Yeah, let's call it code test 3. I think is a good name. I'm going to get rid of the space in there, right? The other thing I'm going to do is, since I'm adding another code test page, I'm going to add that to all of my menu items. So I'm actually going to open up all my code pages here, because I want to add to the navigation of each. And I'm going to leave the template alone for now. But if I was, in an ideal world, I'd be using that, but I'm not. So let's just go page by page then and add a link to that. And I think there's probably an extra space here. Yep. Okay. So I'm just going to copy this, and then I'm just going to paste it in, and I'm going to make it code test 3. And now that I got it pasted in on one page, now I'm just going to go page by page and add it into the same spot, right? This is kind of routine, right? And you see, the other tip you should pick up from this is how methodical I'm being about completing it. And I see a mistake I'm making already, because I changed the link, right? And I'm glad I finally caught it, but I didn't change the text. So now I'm fixing that one at a time, but I'm also trying to be methodical about that. And then after I fix the last one, then I'm going to recopy this to the remaining pages. Like so. And now all the pages have been updated, so the navigation is there. And then I'm just going to come up here and do a save all. So all the pages are saved, and the new page is added to the navigation. And I don't think I really need all of these pages here. So let's just kind of get rid of the stuff we don't need. We can open it up later if we need it. All right. So now on this page, I have like a container made where I was doing flex. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new container here, and I'm going to call it grid container. And I notice I'm like naming this stuff as creatively as I can to come up with fresh names. And I think I'm just going to be silly, and I'm just going to keep adding numbers to it. This is kind of my solution to it. And because I'm doing grid, I think I'm going to add a couple of more divs inside here. So let's add a few more, and then I'm just going to update the numbers here. So I have a 444, a 555, and a 666. Okay. And that's just to have additional items to style. So my outer container is going to be a grid container. So let's save this work so far. Let's take a look at it in the browser for a moment, because we probably haven't done that yet. So there's code 3. I'm clicking on it, and here's my divs. Okay, they're all very boring right now and don't really have any styles. I am going to jump over to W3, and maybe I'll just borrow. I'm tempted to just borrow this code and just roll with it. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to do this. And then, yes, I realize it needs to be fixed, right? Because it's not the right CSS. That's already in my head. So let's open up the CSS file. We're going to go way down to the bottom. And another thing that you might want to do here with your CSS file, and I sometimes do this, is I'll put in comments and I'll say, CSS Grid stuff or something like that, and just put it all in one section and label it, right? It makes it easy to find it. I'll paste that stuff in, but I do know that my container is called grid container. So let's fix that first. So right here, I'm going to say grid container. That's how I named it. Okay. The other thing is I could adjust this CSS, and this has got that kind of hierarchy approach to it. So basically, it's saying that any div that's inside my grid container is basically going to take on this style. All right. And I could also apply individual styles to each box because I did give them all IDs. And in this case, I'm probably not going to do it because I think it's going to work fine without. But let's go back to the browser and look once again. And right away, you know, there's that. It looks like W3 Schools, right? Because I just borrowed their code and their styles. Now, once again, if you guys are going to do this technique, because it's not that hard to do, I would ask that you put your own content into each box. Maybe put some images in one, maybe put some words in another. And I just want to see that you have some purpose for using it. And I mean, I could think of a bunch of stuff like, right, like I could put like a picture up here of, let's say, Jordan Love, picture up here of Aaron Rodgers being sad because he lost, right? Maybe a picture here of like the Packers helmet and the Steelers helmet, like, you know, up against each other. And then here I could add information about the picture, perhaps, right? But mind you, that we don't know where the grid elements are going to end up. And I'm doing this on purpose too, as I'm resizing my screen here. So you can see that that stuff's inside of a container, right? And itself, and it keeps adjusting. And no matter how small I make this, it gets down to like, I guess, here before it breaks. But man, that's really close to a phone size already. So we're doing pretty good with the layout, right? Now, if you decide, of course, that you don't want 2 columns, you want 4, or you don't want 3 columns, you want 2, or something like that, you can play with it, right? Saving the CSS back over here, it's already updated, right? And very powerful, very simple to use. And we're not even getting into the nuances of all the different things that you can do with it. There are a bunch of nuances. So like if you're wondering, and that's kind of where the properties come in here. So like you can do things like, for example, like add these styles basically, or CSS properties, where you can align the content. You can adjust the gap between the columns or the gap between the individual boxes. You can define the grid areas. You can also define a flow, you know, where a column starts and ends. You can declare rows where they start and end. So like, in other words, instead of having the boxes be wherever, you can force them to be in certain spots. And you can create some pretty complicated layouts with this stuff, by the way. The property to display grid we've already played with, so I think we've done a pretty good job with that. I did want to show the inline grid though, and I want you to notice that this container here, right, the one that they're putting it in, is listed as an inline grid, and notice it doesn't have like a size declared to it, right? You know, it's just kind of sitting there, and it's not occupying the whole screen, which I think is kind of interesting as well. It basically sizes itself to the contents within it, which are pretty small. So, for example, if I did 4 columns, right, and ran it, it's going to adjust to that. If I did, you know, 2 columns, it's going to adjust to that. And if the column content is bigger, right? So I, you know, notice what I'm doing here is I'm making them all a little bit bigger. and run it, it just auto adjusts. So this is actually a pretty cool technique, and it does not fill the whole screen. Now keep in mind, if I got rid of this, right, just called it grid, then it fills the whole screen. So that's the difference. Inline grid sizes it to the size of the materials. Regular grid occupies the whole container, right? So depends on what your need is. You know, you might need one situation or you might need the other. And then they go into, once again, the properties that you can apply. They do talk about the fact that we can have tracks, basically, and then you can actually get into sizing things very particularly. So you can say things are a certain length or a certain percentage or a frame unit or the auto technique that we've been using, or you can set up repeats and mins and maxes, and you can get really, really granular about this. And they demonstrate all of those things here. I'm not going to demonstrate all of them, but let's say, for example, you wanted to go for a look like this. Well, they're showing you how, right? And look for the example, borrow from the example, and then build your own thing, you know. They talk about the frame units, which we've played with already, right? Here's one where, you know, the middle one's 2 frames wide, and those are all relative. And then they have the repeat function and then the min max function. I would call all of those, and not necessarily advanced, but kind of like you use them as you need them as opposed to just using them, right? There are these gaps in CSS Grid. So there's what we call row gaps and column gaps, and you can control those separately or collectively, right? So if you use this property, then you're just controlling the vertical ones. If you use this property, you're just controlling the horizontal ones. And if you use this one, you do both at the same time at the same setting, right? So that could be something that you might want to do. So I want you to notice here that I could very simply just borrow this, right, code. Let's take it over to Visual Studio Code. And in my container up top here, I can just say column gap 50. Let's save it and come back over here and then notice the gap, right? So that was a column gap. But what if I instead make that a row gap, right? So saving, there's the difference. And then what if I just use gap? Then of course it will cover both directions. And I'm not saying that looks good, but right, like if you're going for a certain effect, you can kind of achieve it just tinkering a little bit with the examples. All right. I did notice that my screen, I think, just went into night mode without me turning it on. Interesting. I don't know if you guys caught that in watching me or not. All right, I think we're getting towards the end of the CSS Grid stuff. Let's just kind of finish it up here. They okay, so they do columns and rows and gaps, and we did all those. And then, of course, you can control them individually. You can also use the alignment. And there's basically 3 basic alignments that we use, which are justify, align, and place. And if you use justify, you can choose to use any one of these. And they do have examples of them. For example, if you space them evenly, if you put space around, right? Here's space between, right? Here's where you just center it all, where you just move it all the way over to the start, which means the left, all the way over to the end, which means the right, right? And then, of course, they have all these alignment properties that go with, and they kind of keep explaining that. I'm going to kind of cap the CSS Grid stuff there. There's more stuff here that you can read through if you wish. And then I also strongly suggest that you look at the stuff I have here, namely these 2 videos. I think are really good because they don't take very long to watch and they go through a lot of stuff. And then I have all of these links here as well that talk about CSS Grid. All right, let's take a pause here. We're going to do a 5-minute break. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about the other topics. So I'm going to pause the video here. All right, welcome back. We're back from our break, and we're going to move on to other topics now. And I did want to demonstrate a couple of different CSS techniques here that kind of help to add a little, I guess, flair to your pages. And these are, not, mind you, not the only CSS, tricks, if you want to call them that, out there. But I do find that these are particularly helpful ones, and I think they add a really nice look to pages very easily, which is why I'm demonstrating them. The first one that I'm going to demonstrate is this concept that we can have shadows added to the content on our pages. And basically, the net effect of adding a shadow either to text, because we can do it to text, or to do it to any sort of a container that we can see on the screen, is it helps to create like perceived dimensionality. What they're saying at the top here is add depth and emphasis to text and boxes. And I think the first place I'm going to demonstrate this is, let's try it with text, because I think that's a pretty easy one to do. And since we're goofing around on our code test 3 page, and I'm just tempted to just put the material there. And maybe the way to do it is up above here. Why don't we create some sort of let's do like an H2, it's kind of like a reasonable size. And we are talking about the Green Bay Packers. So let's just use that, right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm also going to give this a class, and I'll just call it, how about H2 shadow or something like that? All right, so this is just so I remember it, basically, and I'm going to do one step further and just copy that. Let's go back now to the style sheet, and actually let's save this first. And in fact, let's take a look at it as it sits just like that. So that's what I just added. Nothing too fancy. But it looks all right. It fits, my theme, obviously. I'm going to zoom in on it a little bit, so when I do the shadowing, you can kind of see the net result of it. This works really well, generally speaking, and I want you to think about what we're about to do is we're going to create shadow effects for the stuff on the screen. And that is much more evident if the thing that's casting the shadow has a light background to go onto. So for example, if my background was black and I had, let's say, purple letters, and I'm trying to cast a shadow off of that, I'm probably not going to see it, right? Because the shadows tend to be dark. The important thing to know, though, is that you can actually control the color of the shadow that you're using. In the example here, notice the syntax for this. They just say text dash shadow, and then they put in a bunch of numbers and a color. All right, so let's just kind of mimic what they have here. And I think, I'm not sure where I'm going to put this. I guess I'm just going to put it down here at the bottom. And since our CSS grid stuff is done, why don't I just do this other little divider thing here at the bottom, right? And this is the kind of goofy stuff I would do in my CSS, right? Just to create little sections and you can see it better. I already forgot what I called that. Oh yeah, H2 shadow. So that's a class. So it's going to start with a dot, and I'm going to do H2 shadow. Curly brackets, and then we'll drop in our styles. The style that we're working with is text dash shadow. We do a colon. And then what we normally do is we declare what we call the horizontal offset, the vertical offset, I think it's the spread, and then the color, right? And don't quote me on it if that's absolutely correct. I believe that's correct. And I think the example was like 2 pixels, 2 pixels, 5 pixels, and then they used gray. Okay, which is pretty good color for a shadow, right? All right. So just to talk about the values before we look at the results. So this would be the horizontal offset. So like going across the screen, we're deciding to move the shadow basically 2 pixels to the right of where the content is. If I used a negative number here, it would go to the left. With the vertical offset, it's the same thing. We work top to bottom. So 2 pixel offset means the shadow casts down from the object by 2 pixels. If I used a negative number, it would go up, right? The spread, or like how far the shadow spreads out, is a 5 pixel amount before it fades to nothing. And then gray is not a bad color for a shadow. I might argue you might want it darker. I've also seen people use shadows with really vivid colors and create weird effects. So that's kind of a thing too. But let's see what this looks like first. All right, so saving it. I am going to do the split screeny thing here. And I think that's the right browser window. And there you go. And I don't know if you guys can see that or not, but there is a shadow on the text. Here's how I'll prove that it's there. I'll just remove this and save it. And then notice how the text looks when I put the shadow back and save. Now you can see it, right? And it's very, very subtle. Let me prove that it's there, because some of you are like, I don't really see it, right? Let's make the shadow like a hot pink or something and save that. Now you can see it, right? Okay, I'm not saying that looks good, right? And in fact, it looks pretty horrible, especially considering it's a football team, but you can see the shadow now very clearly. And I want you to kind of like do like a little analysis of what we're seeing on the screen here. So 2 pixel offset means 2 pixels over to the right. 2 pixels for the vertical, that means the shadow is pushing down. And then a 5 pixel spread. I want you to watch what happens here. If let's say I decide to do a negative number on these. So instead of casting down and to the right, it's going to cast up and to the left. So watch the change here, right? Then you can also play with the spread amount. You can make that really small, so it's tighter shadow, or you can make it really large. Not so much, not even looking like a shadow anymore. And who knows, maybe it's an effect you want. I don't know, right? I think the original settings are pretty good, so I'm going to revert back to those. And then I want you to think about the fact that shadows, typically are dark in color, right? Not necessarily black, but at least like a gray of some sort. Oh, that's kind of weird. All right, let's save that and then take a look and notice, okay, maybe that's not so good because now the shadow's too dark and it's kind of making the letters look fuzzy. So it is a little bit of a balancing act to find kind of the right level of shadow, right? Now, whether or not you like this effect, highly subjective. All right, let's play with, we have some containers on the screen here that I can play with, and it doesn't matter if they're in a grid or whatever. I can still apply shadows to these, but I want to kind of tweak this content on the screen a little bit first before I do that. I'm not liking the blue background, so that's the first thing I'm going to fix. In fact, I'm going to make that background pretty light, so I'm going to go with that. Let's save that, and that's a little bit better. And I think that's jumping on the screen because I'm so zoomed in. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit, so when I make changes, it doesn't jump so much. The other thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to target maybe this larger blue box. And I guess the one thing I'm going to do is let's increase the padding a little bit. So let's start with that. Okay, that's a little better. And then I'm going to try to put a shadow on that box. And that container is already defined here. So I'm just going to put the style on this container. And this time, because I'm putting it on a box, and we call it box shadow, right? Same parameters apply. horizontal offset, vertical offset, the spread, and then the color. And we could try the same values. I'm going to try something slightly more. So let's go 3 pixels, 3 pixels. I think the 5 is about right. And then let's choose, I don't know, dark slate gray. All right. Saving it. And there you can see it. Now that doesn't look super great. Let me go back to the page file here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a couple of line breaks or more here at the bottom just to push that content below down out of the way. All right, so now you can see the shadow a little bit better. But notice, I mean, it's kind of a cool effect, right? I mean, the box, instead of just sitting there, now does seem to kind of pop out of the screen a little bit, right? Once again, you can play with these values. So I could put a negative sign here, see the shadow move that way. I could put a negative sign here, make the shadow move the other way, right? And you can play that to your heart's content. And you can make those shadows pretty extreme if you wish, and just play with the numbers, basically play with the colors, play with the numbers and all that. One trick that I've seen recently that I kind of like, and it's really not that recent, honestly, relatively recently for an old person like me, I guess, is some people have been setting their horizontal and vertical offsets to 0 and then increasing the spread by a little bit and doing this kind of a thing. And notice the shadow is now evenly spread behind the box. And I think that's kind of a cool effect too. So it's not like the light's coming from one corner or the other. It's kind of just coming from on top and it's popping forward. I think that's a pretty good effect. So I'm going to kind of stick with that one, right? And you guys can do whatever you want. Play with the numbers to your heart's content. That's a text shadow and box shadow. All right. The other thing that I want to demonstrate here as well, and I'm trying to get back to my lecture notes if I can find them, probably in this browser here. So we did the shadows. I also wanted to show you another really cool technique where we can style our borders a little bit more effectively. And really the effect that I'm kind of shooting for predominantly is to control the radius of the corners of a box. I think it's kind of nice sometimes when you do put a border around a box, and we've talked about this technique here before, right? Where we can choose a pixel amount, a line style, typically solid, but sometimes it's other, and then a color for a border. So let's start by doing that. I think what would be good here is our outer container doesn't have a border yet. Notice the inner ones do, right? 1 pixel solid black, but the outer box doesn't. So I'm going to say border, and then I'm going to say, let's make it 3 pixels. Let's make it dashed, right? Maybe not the best look, but let's just do that just for the sake of it. And then let's pick, I don't know, a color. Let's go red for right now. I will change it, right? But let's just see what that looks like in the browser. Let's do a save over here. And there it is. All right. Love it or hate it. It is what it is, right? I think I'm going to go to solid, save, a little bit better. I hate the red. So let's choose something a little tastier there. Maybe if it's a deep dark red like that, it's okay. Let's save that. And man, that's so deep, dark, and red, I can't even tell that it's red. So let's change that and make it just a little bit, I don't know. Maybe it should be more purpley or something. Something where we can kind of see that color. Very, very hard to see. And I'm actually trying to zoom in to see it. So I think I'm making it too dark, real frankly. So let's just save it. And yeah, now you can see it a little bit more. Right. So those are the kind of little tweaks you make with colors, by the way, to see if they're working or not. All right, so kind of subtle. There's a subtle purple there, and there's a shadow also. As I look at the shadow now, I'm kind of thinking that the box shadow should maybe even have a larger spread to it. Maybe it'll go up to 11 pixels. Yeah, that's all right. Right? Looks pretty good. All right. Now let's play with this concept that we can change on our borders. We can actually change the radius. And this is really kind of an interesting effect, by the way. So I want you to think about this, relative to like these small pixel sizes. The border radius, what it's going to do for us when I utilize it is it's going to allow me to take the corner of a box and basically round it off, right? And I can declare how big that radius is. It can be really small, it can be really dramatic. And on top of it, if I wish, I can actually control each corner separately, which I think is kind of an interesting effect, by the way. All right, so let's just go ahead and get those little annotations out of there. And I'll get rid of my toolbar here. And let's go ahead and I know here in the example, I just basically just did border radius 10 pixels. So we can try the same thing. We'll try it on the outer box first. So I'll do border dash radius and I'll set that to the recommended amount. Let's just do 10 pixels. Let's have the page up on the screen here so it auto refreshes. Here's the save. And supposedly oh no, I didn't save it. Sorry. Here it is. There's the save. And notice how it rounded off the corners. All right. Kind of cool, right? I mean, that's okay. I don't know that I would use that everywhere. Maybe that's a little too subtle. Maybe 20 pixels would be better. I think so, right? But you see the kind of the net effect of that. Now, I can apply that also to the inner boxes. So I could do a border radius of, I don't know, 8 pixels. And let's save that. So now those are all rounded as well. And you can kind of see the look that we're going for. So we can do a combination then of applying borders if we wish. The borders don't have to be there. We can apply shadows to the boxes to give them dimension. I think that's a cool effect. And so, for example, like if you wanted to do shadows on the inner boxes, you could just simply copy these styles over down here, right? I'm not sure that I'd want to apply the same style. I think that looks a little redundant, honestly. But maybe I would do a smaller spread, just make these all smaller numbers and go back to like the traditional approach. And then maybe, I don't know, then maybe make it a little brighter kind of shadow. And there you go. Right, so you can see the effect there. I'm not sure I like that blue as a shadow, but whatever, your choice for your content. So that's a text shadow, border shadows, and border radius. The one thing I do want to point out about the border radius thing, and I'm going to copy this link here and go down to Brave and look at it there. You can create these rounded corners like this, right? And depending on the kind of background you have, you can achieve some pretty cool effects. You can also, and this is kind of the point of why I'm coming here, if you want, not all of the corners have to have a radius on them. You could put it on some and not the others, or more on one and less on another, and none on a different one. And if you wish, you can also kind of do it in one fell swoop. So here's one example of that. And remember, the values would be top, right, bottom, left, treble, right? Or you could do 3 values and it controls 2 corners at the same time, or 2 values and it controls 2 corners at the same time. And actually somewhere, if you start to dig in and start to really play with this pretty deeply, you can do some crazy effects. And I'm going to kind of show you some of the weird things you can do here, right? Like you can make circles or ellipses or really weird things. And I know out on the web, and I'm trying to think of like what the good search criteria is. Shapes made with CSS, I think is maybe a good one. And I think this is the page I'm looking for. And I want you to notice with this page here that just by using CSS, and you can, they show you what the CSS is, you can create all sorts of crazy shapes by just using CSS. And it just kind of blows my mind because no, it's not like you start like scrolling and it's like stars, pentagons, hexagons, what? Right? It's kind of crazy. Yeah, you can even make this stuff, and they show you all the code for it. And some geek like us sat down and figured out how to do it. And I'm like, more power to you, man. I would never spend the time, right? I would just draw it. But holy cow, people have put in and figured this out. That's really a pretty cool link. If you guys are interested, it's in the chat. But yeah, you can create like weird objects and effects, right? And it might be a thing you're looking for. I don't know, right? You know, the very subjective kind of stuff. All right. The other thing that I wanted to kind of circle back to is talking about form fields. And when we were building our forms before, we did some, let's call it rudimentary form building, right? Like we learned about inputs and submit buttons and a couple of other, you know, things like check boxes and radio buttons and select boxes, if you guys remember all that stuff. I do want to point out to you that when HTML5 came out as a standard, they introduced a bunch of new stuff. And so I'm going to copy these once again. Let's go look in Brave here really quickly. Right. And remember, we learned about, you know, all these kind of things, right? The form element, the different, you know, basic type of inputs. We had examples and, you know, all that stuff that we did, right? And pretty common to do, right? Check boxes, radio boxes, submit buttons, all of that. But when HTML5 came out, they did introduce a bunch of new form elements and tools that really were kind of revolutionary, because prior to this stuff coming out, the new stuff that is, you had to use like really fancy JavaScript libraries to create some of the stuff that we're about to see. And now it's just built in. And what I'm trying to show you here are all the different input types there are. And some of them we've used and some of them we have not, right? Some of the weird ones, for example, here's one that's been around for a long time, but hidden. Sometimes we create hidden fields on forms. What do we do with those? We put in sometimes, like I used to use it on e-commerce websites, where I would put in the shipping weight of the product in a hidden field. The users didn't really need to see it or didn't really care, but it would help to do the shipping calculation correctly, right? That kind of thing. But there's some interesting ones that we will take a look at, like color, date, file, and then some of these numeric ones like range and stuff. And notice they even have ones for URLs and things like that. So you can use all of those different ones. And I think they demonstrate just about everything here. So maybe instead of me coding it, well, I do want to code some of it. But you know what? Let's just borrow from them. I'm just gonna I'll show you the color one first, since I just happened to land on it. So what I'm gonna do back here is let's get the other browser window up there with the web page, and then I want to go to my contact page, which is where my form is. And so the one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some form elements, and then time permitting, and I don't know how much time we'll have, we'll see. I'm going to start to style the form a little bit too, right? Which I think, you know, just help it look a little bit better. So way down here at the bottom, if I have any styles, I'm going to add them here. But for right now, I need to open up my contact page. And you know what? I'm going to collapse the sidebar here so we have a little bit more coding space. And I think that'll be good like that. Maybe a little wider, something like that. Okay. So if you remember, we did have a form that we built here. And I'm going to just zoom out just a notch or two, just so we can see it all. And you know what? I should turn on my word wrap. Right. Yeah, it's a little better. All right. So I have my form and it already has a bunch of stuff on it, and that's all well and good. But I think like maybe here, right above this like message box, I'm going to add some of the new stuff that we're talking about. So that stuff's all going to go right into this space here. What I was doing before is I was kind of using line breaks to space everything out. Maybe that's not the best way to do it, but not necessarily a bad way either. So I'm going to take that code now from W3. I'm just going to borrow this. Thank you. And I'm just going to drop it right in here. And you see I've got a label and I have an input type. And I want you to notice it says the type is color. All right, let's save this. It should auto update. And notice it says select your favorite color and watch what it does. It brings up a color panel. How cool is that, right? Interestingly, if I bounce around the tool, you know, it's pretty intuitive to use. I can click a color and notice it gives me the RGB color, right? Which we could use in our HTML code. So here's kind of a thought. You can create your own web page with your own color picker on it, right? So if we're doing HTML work, or if, you know, maybe you have, I don't know, I'm just kind of throwing ideas out there. Maybe you have like a t-shirt company and you want people to be able to choose the color of the writing on the t-shirt. You can have them kind of pick, you know, a color. So this is the color input field. Pretty cool. The output of this, of course, is that RGB code. And that can be captured and then processed with JavaScript, by the way. Going back to the examples here, and I'm trying to find ones that are kind of different. Here's one for birthday. Let's try this one. And this is for of type date. So what I'm going to do here is I am going to, well, actually I can put that one here. I think let's put that one here. So this is a date box. Let's save that. And there it is. And notice it drops a little tool on here and it allows me to type in month, day, year, right? Or I can click a little calendar and I can have it collect a date. That's really slick. This trick in particular blew me away when they added it because we used to have to write so much code to make that stuff happen in the old days. And I'm like, oh, they just added it and it's just there. Great. Right. There saves all that time. I don't have to use JavaScript or jQuery or weird libraries to do it. It's just automatically there. But this is one that you might find pretty useful, I think, right? Especially if you're trying to gather that kind of information. Okay, they do date type local, they do email. I think we've done that already. Here's another kind of a weird one. This is an image one. And I'm going to borrow these line breaks again. And I'm going to just, I guess, paste those in a couple of times. Just so I have some spots to add stuff. Let's go ahead and save the HTML form. And I'm not sure if I just broke this here. Oh, yeah, I sort of did because they're trying to add this in here. And I don't have that image. In fact, this one, let's just take a look at here. Right, so and I'm going to run that again. All right, so let's just kind of take a look at what this does. The input type of image sends the XY coordinates of the click that activated the image button. So notice there's a button here that's got an image. So I would have to come up with an image for it, is why it's not working. I guess I could copy this one if I really wanted. And then when I click on it, it sends back, pretty interesting, the X and Y coordinates of my mouse click, right? Okay, well, that's great. Now what do I do with that? Well, if you were doing a video game, that would be very useful. Like, where did they click? You know, did they click on the bomb, or did they, click on the alligator? You know what I mean? So that would be pretty relevant. So I'm trying to demonstrate that one. I don't want to go through the trouble of getting the image, but whatever. Let's just comment this one out. So I'm going to do an HTML comment here. And I'm just going to put a note, need an image to make it work. I don't want to go hunting right now for one. All right, let's see if there's a couple more we can try, and then we're going to move on to other materials because I do have a bunch of stuff left to do. Here's another one that I think is pretty useful, especially if you're allowing your users to submit files on your website. Okay, so notice the syntax here. The input type is file, right? Saving, and there it comes in. So maybe you have a person, they need to upload a file. Now they can go in here and it invokes your system's file selector. And I could put in my Word document here, and now it's attached. And then, of course, if I needed to process this, and I want you guys to remember this, that requires backend programming, which we haven't learned yet. But we're learning the tools to make it happen on the front end first. And this is the kind of coding we're doing it right now, is what we call front end coding, right? What the user sees. But you can see why this would be useful too. Like maybe think of the t-shirt example again. Maybe somebody's ordering a t-shirt, they have a logo they want to put on it, and they can upload their image file, and you have their logo, and then you can add it to the t-shirt. That would be kind of a cool thing to do. I'm not sure if there's any more I should demo here. You can do the month. Okay, that's kind of like the date one. And okay, well, I think this one's kind of useful too, right? This is a number entry field. So I'll add that. I'll add that up here, right, since we have kind of like a space for it, basically. Saving. And then notice here, it gives you a little box, and I got a little up down arrow to put in a value between 1 and 5. And I can basically set the values. If I wanted to go from 1 to 100 or whatever, I can do that here. So that's kind of cool too. Another one that they have that's similar, I think this is the one I'm thinking about, the range command. Let me see if this is the one I'm thinking about. So I'm going to place that right below this one, but I am going to put in some line breaks right there, just so they're split apart a little bit. And then there you go, right? So you could have, for example, a slider. And what this is kind of interesting too, is like when I move the slider and let go, it's setting a value. And then that value can once again be captured by something like JavaScript, and then you can use it to control other things, So I think that's a pretty good smattering of learning about some new form field things. I think I hit all the ones that they have here. Yep, I sure did. There are more, by the way, that you can play with and learn about. And there's also a bunch of ways that you can kind of use them to do kind of higher level things. I am kind of starting to run out of time here. So like, I think what's going to happen is I'll do a little bit of a demo on how to style my form fields somewhat. And then the styling of a table will probably have to wait either till next week, or I'll just do a separate video on it perhaps to demonstrate that. What I will show you though very quickly, actually, maybe I don't need to do that. In fact, why don't I'll circle back to the form thing. And there's some examples here of like how you can style a form, but I'm going to do the styling of tables. Let's go back to our site really quick, and somewhere on this site, and I forget where, right here is my beautiful table. It's on the about page. Right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open that about page here in the editor, so I can see my table, right? I'm going to also just kind of create a little bit of visual space around it. I'm going to do it very primitively. I'm just going to use line breaks, both above and below. Let's save that so you can see there's a little more space there. And now let's play with some of the styles. Now, here's what I'm going to do just to kind of save time is I'm going to borrow the styles right from here. Now, when I do that, it puts me in edit mode, so I have to like kind of change this. But I'm gonna kind of borrow them right from here, so I don't have to retype them all. I'm hoping it doesn't interfere with other styles that I have already created for the table. But let's go look and find those styles here. And if I remember right, pretty early on, I did a little bit of, and notice all the styling I did was just basically putting borders on the table so I could see the stuff. That's all I did, right? So what I'm going to do is let's take this out of here. I'm just going to get rid of it here. And then way at the bottom in my CSS file, in fact, why don't I do this? Let's do another one of these like silly little dividers. And maybe I'll just call it like right in the middle here. We'll just like table style, right? And then I think I have to come back here, copy this again. And then I'm just going to paste all of these in. I'm just going to show you really quick what some of these are. Some of them are pretty basic. And the one thing that we are doing is we are putting borders around the THs and the TDs and padding, which is space inside the cells, right? Just give them a little breathing room. The THs will have a background color of green, and then the text color will be white. The table itself will be 100% of the width of the container that it's in. And then it's got this border collapse thing, which basically controls the border from kind of spilling over as a way to describe it, I suppose. And then this last one here, I'm going to comment out for now, and then I'm going to come back and talk about it. But this is the one that does the striping of the table contents, and we'll talk about how that works in a second. Let's look at this first. So I'm going to get back to my table, and I'm going to do a save. So here's the save. Oh, sorry. We want to save over here, not in the HTML document. And there's the change. So the THs and the top of the table, those got the green background, and then notice white text. It doesn't look too bad, right? I'm not really sure I like how this stuff is looking here. Like my TDs, I might want to have like a separate, like, I don't know, maybe the left padding should be more on the TDs, or maybe I don't know. I mean, you can like be very subjective about this stuff. Maybe I'll just leave it as is. Do notice that the THs and the TDs do have a border, but it's like this like weird color. And maybe instead of combining the TH and the TD here together, I could do the TDs separately, and then I could do a border and padding, and then I could tweak it basically. And instead of using this color, I might use something, I don't know, more Green Bay like maybe. Let's try that again. Maybe in the green-ish dark range, something like that. Let's save it. All right, so now you can see it. I'm not sure that looks good, but hey, whatever. Play with it. Once again, is the answer. Maybe the padding is okay, but maybe I could do the top right, bottom left thing. So maybe top at 8, right at 8, bottom at 8 are all fine, but I want the left to be 20 pixels. Let's save that. And boy, that didn't work. Top right, bottom left. Oh, I see. I broke it. No wonder. No wonder it didn't work. So there it is with the names moved away a little bit. I'm really hating that border though. I think I might go kind of back to what they had. Let's save that. Yeah, not too bad. All right. This last one here is kind of an interesting one, because here in this style that we're about to use, we're using what we call a pseudo class technique on the table, by virtue of adding a colon here. And we're saying that the nth child, and this is a little bit more advanced CSS, and you can look up this technique if you wish, but it's basically saying that of all the rows in the table, the even numbered ones will get this background color. right? So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Watch the table as I save and notice what it does. Now I don't have a lot of entries in here, but notice how it's like the second one is white, and then I can alternate colors. And you know what? That's kind of cool because I can, like, one thing, like when you look at tables of information, sometimes it's hard to see all the information, and what, like, striping the table allows you to see the stuff better. So, like, for example, I can also switch on a style for odd and maybe make that one like a gray, and then they will alternate white and gray. Not a good color choice, but maybe it should be a little bit lighter, right? Kind of something like that. You kind of see where I'm going with that. And then if the table continued, the striping would continue, right? So basic table styling techniques. I do have 4 minutes left, so I'm going to try to do some form styling here. I'm not sure how far I'll get, but I'll give that a shot. So that was my table style. So I'm going to kind of put in a little divider here too. And then here, let's do form style. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do with my form is I'm just going to apply right to the form tag itself. I want to put it in a container that looks like a container. So I am going to do a border. And let's just do really basic stuff here. 2 pixels, solid, and let's do dark blue. Great. That looks good. Saving. All right. Okay, maybe not so great. Words are touching the edges. Let's put in some padding. Let's make that somewhat large amount of padding. All right, stuff's moved away from the edges. Let's make the background color something different. I don't know, let's find one here that kind of gets us somewhere. Let's try that. Saving. Okay, a little too bright for my eyes. I'm going to just soften that up a little bit towards the white. Saving. Okay, not too bad. Right. Other thing that we can do is we can set fonts. So I can do a whole font family if I wish. And I'm going to pick one that I think looks kind of modern. I think I'm already using, I think this one on a global level. Maybe I'll try this Franklin Gothic medium approach. Saving. All right. Okay. That's kind of okay-ish, right? Maybe you like it, maybe you don't. All right. Maybe we can do some of our fancy, we could word wrap this too, by the way. Maybe we can do some stuff in addition to this. Maybe we can have a border radius on the outer box. And I'll go 15 pixels on that. Extra semicolon there. And could we put a box shadow on this? Sure. Let's just borrow one right here. Save it. All right. So you kind of see, like, very quickly, kind of making it look a little better each time. The other thing that you can do is you can also style the input boxes themselves. So, for example, since those have, input tag attached to them, those can also get some padding on the inside. I do like this technique a lot. Watch the text boxes. Notice how they got a little bit bigger, and now there's some space inside there. And I might also make the font size just a little bit bigger than it is. Maybe like I'll go 1.2 M, which is 120%, basically, saving it. And notice how it got a little bit bigger. Maybe that's a little extreme. All right, maybe I don't like that one so much. Maybe, I don't know, it's subjective for sure, right? But I can also, and this is really weird, I can put border radiuses on those input boxes too. Maybe I'd make it smaller. Okay, not too bad, right? I could change the background color here. I could change the font color here. Heck, I could even put an image in the background if I wanted to, right? Um, I might put on the outside of the box a margin on the top of 5 pixels because I do notice that the label text above is like touching it, right? So that gives it a little space above, right? And this process continues, right? Like, so if you really look at people who have really nice looking forms and look at all the stuff they've done to them, next time you're on a website, check it out and analyze it and go, oh, yeah, that does make it look a whole lot better. Um, this is a really primitive example of styling a form, and I wish I had more time to kind of expand on it. But my encouragement for you is be mindful of the fact that you can style your forms and make them look a lot better. And like one of the things I see here, right, is I think like all the stuff on the left here is maybe too close to the left margin, right? So maybe with padding, once again, I might go 30 all the way around, but maybe the left and right padding is 50 pixels, right? And then it moves the content over just a little bit more. Okay. So, folks, I am going to have to cap it here. So this lecture will end here. But please experiment with the forms and style them, experiment with your tables, and try all the new things that we demonstrated here today. So this video